Snow had started falling just before sunset. It wasn't the loud kind of snow, the kind that demanded attention, but the quiet sort, drifting slowly like it had all the time in the world. It dusted the rooftop of the elementary school and muted the usual after-school chaos of shouting children and honking car horns. Inside the aging gymnasium, a different sort of storm was brewing. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and chairs scraped across the hardwood floor as parents claimed their spots, some with steaming thermoses, others with the tired energy of people showing up because they were supposed to. Daniel sat in the last row, farthest from the stage. He hadn't meant to choose that seat, but when he'd walked in, something about the front felt too exposed, too expectant. In the back, he could disappear into the hum of the room. He adjusted his scarf, the one Mara had knit with mismatched yarn 2 winters ago, green, orange, and something that might have been beige but had faded too much to tell. His fingers worked the fraying edge as he kept his eyes fixed on the curtain. Mara was behind that curtain. His little girl. 10 years old, hair tied back in a ribbon she'd picked out herself, shoes 2 sizes too big because he couldn't find black flats in her size at the second-hand shop, and a dress they'd stitched together on weekends. Him, clumsy with a needle, and her, meticulous. The hem wasn't straight, but it swayed beautifully when she walked. He exhaled slowly, trying not to think about how much she wanted this. They'd practiced at home for weeks, him sitting cross-legged on the rug while she played on the upright piano that hadn't been tuned since before her mother passed. The song she chose was simple, a lullaby no one else would recognize, but it meant something. It was the one her mother had sung to her when she was little, the one Mara used to hum in her sleep before silence took its place. Daniel never said no to her performing. Even if his stomach twisted with worry, the murmur of the crowd swelled briefly, then dipped again. People leaned into each other, shared laughter, pointed at the program. Daniel noticed a woman in a pressed coat and sleek boots glance toward the stage, then whispered to the man beside her. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. He caught them. Poor girl. The man didn't respond. He just nodded, lips pressed in the kind of smile that had pity behind it. Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked at the small paper program in his hand. Mara's name circled in pencil. Mara Ellis, piano solo. No last-minute fancy title, no elaborate font. Just her name. Just her. A week ago, she'd asked him, "Do you think Mom would like it?" He hadn't known what to say. He just touched the side of her face and whispered, "She already does." Mara was the kind of girl who noticed things. She didn't always speak them, but she saw them. The cracks in wallpaper, the way someone's voice changed when they were lying, how tired he looked even when he smiled. She'd started writing letters to her mother after she turned 6, tiny ones folded neatly and placed under her pillow like teeth. He never read them, never asked. He just made sure there were always envelopes. The curtain shifted, and Daniel sat up straighter. It wasn't her turn yet. Another kid took the stage, a boy in a crisp suit, tap shoes clicking loud and fast against the floor. The crowd laughed, clapped along, some even whistled. Daniel clapped too, politely, but his eyes kept drifting toward the wings of the stage. He imagined Mara standing there, trying to breathe, holding her charm bracelet the way she always did. When she was nervous, that bracelet had become her ritual. Each charm represented something. A ladybug for her mom's favorite garden patch, a small silver book for the stories Daniel read to her when she couldn't sleep, a piano key they found at a flea market last summer. She touched them like prayer, beads, each one anchoring her. The music ended. Applause followed. Then silence again. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note, a crinkled piece of lined paper with a stick figure drawing. Him and her, on stage. She'd drawn a smiley face on both of them, and above it wrote, "We got this, Dad." Her confidence in him always came as a surprise, like he was someone who deserved it. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't nerves. Exactly. It was the weight of wanting her to feel like she belonged. A volunteer stepped on stage and announced the next act. Mara's name. The gym quieted. Daniel sat forward. The curtain opened slowly, and there she was. Mara walked across the stage carefully, as though each step mattered. Her dress caught the light in odd, shifting ways. She reached the piano bench, paused, and turned toward the audience with wide, uncertain eyes. She looked so small. Daniel held his breath. A cough echoed from somewhere in the crowd. Someone dropped a pen. There were rustles and murmurs, and Daniel's heart raced at the thought that it might be too much, that maybe she'd turn and run off stage, and he wouldn't blame her if she did. But she sat down. Her feet didn't quite reach the floor. She adjusted the bench. Then, in a movement so subtle most would miss it, she ran her thumb over the bracelet on her wrist. Then she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note was soft, hesitant, like it had to sneak past the silence. Another followed, and another, each one blooming into the next like footsteps down a familiar path. The lullaby filled the room, not perfect. A few notes slipped, others hesitated, but the melody held, and it did something else too. It quieted the buzz in people's minds. It slowed time. Daniel sat there, frozen. The song opened something inside him, something he'd kept, locked since the hospital room, since the day he had to explain to a 4-year-old that her mother wasn't coming back. He hadn't cried then, but he did now. 2 rows ahead, the woman who had whispered earlier turned slightly. Daniel watched her shoulders stiffen. A child beside her leaned closer. "Is that the sad song from that movie?" "No," she whispered. "I don't think it's from anything." Mara's hands faltered once, then steadied. Her head tilted the way it always did when she played, not trying to look graceful, just listening harder. And then, just as the final note hung in the air, her foot slipped and struck the pedal wrong. The sound cracked. It wasn't a huge mistake. Not really. But in that breath of silence after the last note, it felt enormous. Someone chuckled. Quietly. Not malicious, but thoughtless. Mara's eyes darted toward the crowd. Daniel started to rise from his seat. He didn't know what he would do. Just move. Go to her. Pull her off that stage and tell her nothing mattered more than her courage. But before he could stand, someone else did. A woman. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, hair silver and wild around her shoulders. No one had noticed her before. She wore a green shawl and held herself like someone who'd lived too many lives to care what people thought anymore. She moved toward the stage, slow and purposeful. The crowd murmured. The teachers looked at each other, and then she did something. No one expected. She climbed the steps and walked to the piano, knelt beside Mara, and whispered something. Mara blinked, then nodded. The woman placed her hands on the keys beside Mara's. Together they began to play. Not the same lullaby, but something that folded into it. A harmony, a lift. Then she sang, soft, low, almost too quiet to catch at first. But her voice was velvet and wind, a mother's hum in the dark, a river winding through loss. The room held its breath, and somewhere in the back row, Daniel let out the smallest exhale and felt for the first time in years that maybe the world still held room for kindness. Mara looked up from the keys, saw her father, and smiled. After the performance, the gymnasium didn't erupt in the usual chaotic applause. It was quieter, thick with something deeper than approval. Not awe, exactly. Not sadness. But recognition. That a child had reached out in the middle of something, uncertain and beautiful, and someone had reached back. Daniel waited in the hallway outside the dressing rooms, his coat folded over one arm, the other hand gripping a small bouquet of flowers with clumsy plastic wrapping. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at the closed door for any sign of movement. The bouquet was too much. He knew it. The flowers weren't fresh, and the paper around them was from the corner pharmacy. But they were what he could afford, and he needed to hold something in his hands or he'd fidget himself into the floor. The door opened slowly. Mara stepped out. Her hair was a little frizzed from where she'd tugged at the ribbon. Her cheeks were flushed. She held her bracelet like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. "You were amazing," Daniel said. The words caught, somewhere between pride and disbelief. "Really? You didn't just play, you spoke." Mara tilted her head, eyes searching his face like she wanted to believe him but wasn't sure if she should. "You mean that?" Every word. She looked down at the bouquet and reached out without asking, fingers grazing the petals. "These are for me?" He nodded. "Of course." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. They started walking toward the car. The night colder now, the snow heavier. Their boots crunched through the white carpet that had thickened since they arrived. Streetlights cast long shadows that swayed and stretched with the wind. "Who was she?" Mara asked quietly. "The woman who played with me? I was going to ask you the same thing. She just showed up." Daniel slipped the keys from his pocket, then hesitated. "What did she say to you? When she whispered?" Mara stopped beside the passenger door. "She said, 'You already know how to do this. I'm just here so you don't feel alone.'" Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then opened the door. They drove in silence, but it was a silence full of thoughts. Mara held the bouquet like a small shield, her fingers brushing each flower. Daniel kept glancing at her in the mirror, trying to see past her quiet. It wasn't until they were home and inside, boots by the radiator and coats on the hooks, that she finally asked the question that had been forming in her. "Dad, why don't people talk about Mom?" He paused at the kitchen counter, hand resting on the kettle. "They do." "No, they don't. Not really. They just change the subject." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked over at the photo of Mara and her mother on the fridge, taken on the day they planted lavender in the yard. Her mom's hands were muddy, her eyes squinting from the sun, her smile real. There'd been a time when her laughter was the soundtrack of the house. "It's hard for people," he said finally, "to talk about someone they miss. Some people think saying her name might make things worse. But it doesn't." "No, it doesn't." Mara sat at the table, legs tucked beneath her. "She used to sing that lullaby to me. I don't remember all the words, but I remember how it felt. Daniel made tea without asking if she wanted any. Chamomile, the only one she ever drank." He set the cup in front of her and sat across the table. "I think people avoid it because they don't want to cry in front of a kid," he said. "They think they're protecting you." "Are you protecting me?" He didn't know how to answer that. He reached for his own cup and sipped it like it held the response. "I used to think if I talked about her too much, I'd fall apart. But you didn't." "No." He smiled. "You didn't let me." She looked down into her tea. "I miss her?" "I know." Mara's voice was softer now. "Do you think she misses us?" Daniel blinked hard, his gaze fixed on the steam curling from his mug. "If there's anything after this, I think she's right here. Every time you play. Every time you smile that certain way. Every time you make me feel like I'm not doing this alone." She nodded. Not the way children do when they pretend to understand, but like she actually did, like her small heart had made space for truth even when it hurt. That night, after she went to bed, Daniel stayed up staring at the piano. He traced his fingers along the keys but didn't press any. The house was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, something was shifting. He didn't know what yet. In the following days, the performance became a story that moved through the town like winter wind. Quiet, but insistent. People brought it up in grocery store lines, at bus stops, in between sips of bitter coffee in staff rooms. The mysterious woman, the harmony, the way Mara had kept playing. Teachers started asking Daniel if they could feature her in the spring recital. Parents dropped off extra sheet music, some offering old instruments they didn't use anymore. Daniel appreciated the kindness, but he kept a certain distance. He didn't want Mara to become a symbol. She was a little girl who missed her mom, who played piano because it made her feel close to something she'd lost. Not because she wanted a spotlight, but not everyone respected boundaries. One afternoon, a reporter showed up outside their apartment. Young, eager, with a mic clipped to his coat and a camera operator standing just behind. Daniel answered the door cautiously. Hi, Mr. Ellis, right? I'm Ian Thomas from Channel 9. We've been hearing about your daughter's performance last week. Incredible stuff. Really moving. Daniel said nothing, his hand tightening on the doorknob. We'd love to do a short feature. A local, feel-good story. Maybe an interview with your daughter? She's 10, of course. It'd be very gentle, very respectful. Just a few questions. How she felt up there, what inspired the piece. Daniel stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Listen, he said. She's a child, not a headline. Ian hesitated. I understand, but people are moved. They're inspired by her courage. Her story deserves to be shared. No, Daniel said, his voice firmer now. Her story deserves to be hers, not packaged. The reporter backed off, clearly sensing the boundary. Daniel watched them leave, then exhaled. Later that evening, he told Mara about the reporter. She didn't seem surprised. They want a story because someone helped me. No, Daniel said gently. They want it because you didn't fall apart when something went wrong. But I almost did. But you didn't. She was quiet, then said, I think the woman was a story. She didn't even tell me her name. Daniel paused. Do you think she was real? I think she was what I needed, Mara said. A week passed. Then 2. The snow began to melt, slushing up the sidewalks and revealing lost gloves and forgotten bits of winter. Mara kept playing, but now something had changed. She played with intention. Not just practice, but purpose. One day after school, Daniel came home to find her playing something unfamiliar, a song he'd never heard before. It wasn't perfect. It stumbled in places, but it was hers. You wrote that? She nodded. It doesn't have a name yet. He sat on the floor, just like old times. Play it again. And she did. He closed his eyes and listened, not just to the music, but to the way she breathed between phrases, the way the keys responded like they knew her hands, the way the melody held ache and joy in equal measure. When the song ended, she said, I'm going to play this one at the spring recital. He raised an eyebrow. You already agreed, I told Mrs. Langley today. Daniel felt something tighten and release all at once in his chest. You're brave. I'm still scared, she admitted, but it doesn't feel like it's just me anymore. She touched her bracelet, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The house was quiet except for the settling creaks of old wood and the distant sound of someone walking a dog outside. Then Daniel asked, What if I played with you? Just a few notes. Like she did. Mara turned to him, eyes wide with wonder. You'd really do that? He smiled. I already do, every time you sit down. That night they started practicing. Together. Daniel tapped the last note of the melody with the pad of his finger, holding it longer than the sheet music indicated. Mara looked up from her side of the piano bench, a tiny smile tugging at her lips. She didn't correct him this time. Instead, she mirrored the expression like they were in on the same quiet secret, one that lived only in the spaces between their music. Outside, early spring was awakening the neighborhood. Children zipped by on bicycles with training wheels. Dogs barked. From backyards, and wind carried the scent of thawed earth. Inside, the apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee grounds. A new rhythm had emerged, one that hummed with shared purpose. Their evenings belonged to music now, not just routine survival. Daniel hadn't played in years. His fingers once, confident, now stumbled often. He winced at every misstep, but Mara was patient. She never laughed, never flinched. She simply waited and encouraged with a quiet nod or a gentle re-entry into the bars that tripped him up. It was humbling and healing all at once. Each note was another stone in the slow rebuilding of something he hadn't realized he'd let collapse. They called it Mara's song for now. It evolved daily. Notes added, rhythms adjusted, sometimes entire sections rewritten when a mood no longer fit. The melody had started as hers, raw and uncertain, but now it belonged to them both. You want to play the harmony this time? She asked after one particularly smooth run. Daniel shook his head. You lead, I'll follow. That became their silent motto. She led, and he followed. Not just in music, but in life. The spring recital loomed closer. Invitations were sent. Home, folded into backpacks, stuck with magnets onto refrigerators across the district. Mara didn't tell many people. She didn't want it to be a spectacle. Just a song. Just her and her dad. And a memory shaped into something new. On the night of the recital, Daniel wore the suit he hadn't touched since the funeral. It felt stiff, as though it belonged to another man. He didn't say much while he tied his tie. His hands trembled more than they should have. Mara wore a soft blue dress, nothing flashy. She refused to let anyone curl her hair. Mom wouldn't do that, she'd said when Daniel offered. She didn't mean it harshly. It was just a statement of truth. And he understood. They were playing the song for her, not for an audience. Backstage was a different world. Murmurs, tuning, the sharp clack of heels on polished floors, the sound of breathing, nervous, excited, expectant. Parents whispered words of encouragement through cracked doors. Teachers flitted between students, clipboard in hand. Mara sat with her bracelet clenched in one palm, her other hand resting lightly on the edge of the keyboard. Daniel sat beside her, legs too long for the child-sized bench, trying not to let the rising tension eat through his calm exterior. "You okay?" he whispered. "I think so." She exhaled, closed her eyes for a second, then nodded to herself. A quiet knock on the frame signaled their cue. Daniel stood first and held out his hand as she took it, fingers cold but steady. Together they stepped onto the stage. The lights weren't blinding like he'd feared. They were warm. The auditorium held a respectable hush, not silence, the kind of quiet that comes when a room leans forward in anticipation. Daniel sat first, his legs cramped beneath the piano. Mara followed, placing her fingers on the keys as if greeting old friends. They glanced at each other once, just long enough to confirm what words couldn't. And then they played. The first few notes carried hesitance, but it wasn't weakness. It was reverence, a careful touch, as though honoring something fragile. Then, the melody unfurled. It danced gently at first, curling through the air with a kind of sorrowful grace. Midway, Daniel picked up the harmony, wrapping his part around hers like arms around shoulders in a hug no one had to see to understand. Mara's hands never faltered, not once. Even as her eyes welled slightly, even as her throat tightened with the emotion she'd kept tucked between ribs for too long. The final note didn't need to linger. It just ended, clean and true. The silence that followed felt like a held breath slowly exhaled. There was a pause, a beat too long for comfort. Then the clapping began. Not explosive, not wild, just sincere, deep, sustained. Mara bowed her head. Daniel stood and offered her his hand again. They walked off stage without looking back. Backstage, the atmosphere had changed. Children smiled brighter. Adults looked at Mara not with pity but with respect. Her teacher dabbed at her eyes. A boy in the grade above hers muttered something about how cool the song had been. Mara accepted it all with a quiet humility that made Daniel's chest ache with pride. Later, in the car, she turned to him with a grin. "You were off in the third part." "I was not," he shot back, mock offense thick in his tone. She laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh in weeks. "You totally were. You hit G instead of F sharp." "I was improvising," he defended, grinning. "Oh, so now we're a jazz duo? Let's not get carried away." She leaned her head against the window, the chill of the glass pressing through her hair. "Thanks for playing with me, Dad. I wouldn't have missed it for anything." The following morning, things didn't return to normal. Not exactly. They'd turned a corner. Something had shifted, opened. At breakfast, Mara asked if they could record the song. Daniel agreed. He brought out his old USB microphone from the drawer where cords and dust had tangled into a graveyard of forgotten tech. They recorded it twice, once for them and once for someone else. That afternoon, Mara placed a flash drive into a small white envelope and wrote, in neat print, "For Mrs. Lowell, with love." They brought it to the cemetery and tucked it under the flower vase. No words were said. They stood for a few minutes, then walked away hand in hand. At school, kids started asking Mara if she'd write more music. One even asked if she could teach him to play. She said maybe. Maybe meant she was thinking about it. Daniel signed them, up for weekend piano lessons, joint ones. They learned new pieces together. Sometimes they fought over rhythm. Sometimes they laughed so hard they couldn't play. But always, they returned to Mara's song as their anchor. As the months stretched. Into summer, they performed it at 2 more school events. Each time, the arrangement was slightly different. Not because they couldn't remember the original, but because they had changed. Their grief had grown new colors, shades of joy, of peace, of memory without the sting. One warm June evening, they were invited to a small community concert at the library. Mara agreed, but only on one condition. She comes again. Daniel blinked. Who? The woman who helped me. The first night. He wanted to ask more. Who she really was. What she looked like, where she had gone, but Mara just said, she'll know. On the night of the concert, they arrived early. Set up, tuned, rehearsed. And just before they went on, Mara looked toward the back row. There was a woman in a gray scarf seated alone. She didn't wave. Didn't nod. Just smiled. Mara didn't say anything. She walked on stage, sat beside her father, and began to play. This time the song was lighter, brighter, like someone had opened the windows in their hearts and let the air in. The melody swirled, reaching and landing and rising again. It ended not with finality, but with hope. The woman in the gray scarf was gone by the time they finished. No one had seen her leave. Later, as they packed up, Daniel looked at his daughter. Did you see her? Mara nodded. She still doesn't tell me her name. Maybe she doesn't need to. No, Mara said, voice soft. I already know it. They didn't talk more about it. Some stories didn't need full explanations to be real. On the walk home, under a sky full of stars, Daniel reached for Mara's hand. She took it without hesitation, and somewhere behind them, the echo of a song, unfinished, ever-changing, followed quietly through the night. Daniel awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, though the morning air was cool and still. It had been weeks since he'd had one of the dreams. The music was always there, reverberating, echoing, but now someone else was playing, someone he couldn't see. And just before waking, the melody always unraveled, not into chaos, but into silence, the kind that deafens and unnerves. He sat up slowly, hands pressed against his face. Mara's door was cracked open down the hall, light spilling from inside. She was always up early now, either tinkering on the keyboard or scribbling in her music notebook. He often wondered if the silence he felt was because she was finding her own voice. Downstairs, the mail was already in the slot. He grabbed the bundle without looking, sorting as he walked back to the kitchen. Bills, junk ads, a small padded envelope with no return address. He paused. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted, precise. He slid it open and found a USB drive. And a folded note, play this when alone. It's not over. He stared at it, pulse quickening. The initial struck something in him, though it was impossible, absurd. He slipped the drive into his pocket, feeling its weight through his jeans. Mara walked in behind him, yawning. Morning, she said, grabbing cereal without looking. Hey, he said, his voice too casual. How'd you sleep? She shrugged. Dreamt about the woman again. Daniel stopped mid-pour. What woman? She blinked. The one in the scarf, from the library concert. He nodded slowly. What did she do? She didn't play this time. Just watched, but she wasn't alone. There was someone standing in the shadows behind her. I couldn't see his face, but he felt wrong. Daniel tried to keep his expression neutral, but a chill settled in his chest. She said something, Mara added quietly. She said the melody isn't finished. Daniel placed the milk down, carefully. Do you want to skip school today? Mara shook her head. No, I'm fine. But she wasn't. Her eyes carried a quiet worry, like something was trailing her just out of reach. After dropping her off, Daniel returned home and plugged in the USB. The file was titled Dissonance. He clicked it. The piece began with the familiar tones of Mara's song, but quickly turned darker, notes flattened, tempo unstable, dissonant chords crawling beneath what used to be harmony. It felt like someone had taken their music and twisted. It bent it into a mirror reflection full of shadows. In the middle, a woman's voice hummed a counter-melody, soft, beautiful, but tinged with sorrow. Then abruptly, silence. A few seconds later, a voice, distorted, male, spoke only 4 words. "You opened the door." The file ended. Daniel yanked the drive out and deleted the temporary files. His heart hammered. He wasn't superstitious, but this felt deliberate. Not coincidence. Not coincidence at all. That evening, Mara was quieter than usual. She didn't touch the piano. Her bracelet, once a constant fixture, was missing from her wrist. Daniel noticed immediately. "Where's your bracelet?" She didn't meet his eyes. "It's gone. I think I left it at school." Daniel didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Not yet. That night, she didn't dream of the woman. She dreamt of fire, the sheet music. On her stand, ignited, the notes blistering into ash. A shadowy figure stood behind the flames, playing a piano that echoed from nowhere, keys clashing, wood groaning like a thing alive. And behind him, someone watched. A child. A girl. She woke, gasping. Downstairs, Daniel was already pacing. He couldn't sleep either. Something hung in the house now. An energy he couldn't name but couldn't deny. He turned to her as she entered. "I think someone's trying to use our music." Mara didn't even question it. She just nodded. "It's not just ours anymore." "Is it?" No, together they sat at the piano. Not to play, but to remember. They pulled out every draft they'd ever written, every variation, every harmony. But there were pages missing. "I had the second transition in this folder," Mara said, flipping wildly. "I had it right here." Daniel reached for the bookshelf where the old recorder sat. It blinked red. Someone had turned. "It on?" He pressed play. The house filled with the sound of their song, but slower, reversed, and beneath it whispering. Mara clapped her hands over her ears. "Make it stop." He did. Silence fell again, heavy and immediate. They both stared at the piano, then at each other. "We have to finish it," Mara said. Daniel frowned. "But we did. We ended it." She shook her head. "We ended it for us, not for them." They spent the next 2 hours rebuilding the song. Not as it had been, not even as it had become, but as it needed to be, a counter to the darkness that had crept into their lives. They modulated keys, reshaped bridges, rewrote transitions to cut through the warped echoes. By morning, they had it, a final piece. "We record it," Mara said. "We make it permanent, like a lock." Daniel didn't question her. They recorded it 3 times, layering the tracks. Mara played with closed eyes, her hands fluid and confident. Daniel added harmony like armor. They embedded their emotion into every bar: fear, love, loss, defiance. After the last note faded, Daniel saved it under a single name: Resolution. That afternoon, the house felt lighter, brighter, until they found the envelope on the doorstep. Inside, only a message: "You're too late." It has her now. Daniel's blood ran cold. Mara was in the backyard, lying in the grass, eyes closed. "Sweetheart," he called, heart pounding. No response. He ran to her, kneeling. "Mara!" Her eyes fluttered open. "It's okay," she whispered. "I saw her again, but she wasn't the same." "What do you mean?" "She was crying. She told me she failed, that she played the melody wrong. And now it's trapped." Daniel didn't understand. "What's trapped?" Mara turned her head slowly. "Me." Then everything went black. When he woke, he was on the living room floor. His ears rang. The USB drive was shattered in the center of the room. The piano bench lay overturned. The piano keys had cracked, some warped as though burned. Mara was gone. He ran through the house, calling her name, flinging open closets, scouring the street. Nothing. Then he heard it, the music, coming from upstairs. He followed the sound to her bedroom. The door creaked open. There she sat, at a second piano that shouldn't be there, one made entirely of shadow. The room flickered between reality and something darker, deeper. Behind her, the woman in the scarf stood with a sorrowful gaze. "She's playing it backwards," the woman said. "She thinks she can undo it. What is this? What's happening to her? She's trying to save you." Mara's hands blurred over the phantom keys. The melody was wrong, twisted, jagged, haunting. Daniel stepped forward. "Mara, stop! I have to!" she screamed. "I can't let it take you too!" The woman turned to him. "She needs an anchor, or she won't come back." Daniel didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, took Mara's hands off the keys and wrapped her in his arms. "It's done," he whispered. "We already wrote the end." He began to hum Resolution, soft and steady, the real version. She trembled in his grip. Then slowly, she joined in. Together, they hummed, the melody wrapping around them like a cocoon. The dark piano dissolved. The flickering stopped. The woman in the scarf nodded once and vanished. Mara collapsed into his chest, sobbing. "I thought I lost you," she said. "Never," Daniel whispered. "Not even for a second." Downstairs, the recorder blinked green. A new track had been saved. Later, they would play it back and realize something chilling. There had been a third voice in the harmony. Not male, not female, something else. But for now, they sat by the broken piano, holding each other, listening to the silence they had earned. The kind that follows. Not grief, but triumph. The song was done, or so they hoped.